Aerodinosaur is proud to introduce a new Propliner book by me, John Andrew Reed, now available on Amazon.com, entitled Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans. This book is 388 pages long and features 64 full narrative chapters with over 280 black and white photographs, complete with detailed captions. The bulk of the story and most of the photographs have never been published before. All this for only $24.95. Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans helps the reader make sense of a perplexing era in North American aviation. The chapters are in chronological order, beginning in the early 1960s, consisting of first- and second-hand stories about obsolete Propliner passenger and freight operations that continued long after the dawn of the jetliner age, well past their technological prime and intended use into the early 2000s. If you like stories about the overextended use of DC-6s, DC-7s, Lockheed Constellations and Electras, Martin 404s, Convair liners, and Curtiss C-46s, and the unique personalities that flew them, this is where you will find it all. The stories behind many of our Aerodinosaur videos on this channel are found in this book. The reader will experience this era through my own experiences and through the eyes of some of the key people who operated and flew Propliners during this time period, mainly out of St. Louis, Kansas City, Detroit, and the infamous Corrosion Corner at Miami International Airport, flying passengers, general freight, automotive freight, and overnight courier freight. You'll experience the prevalence of lax air regulations during that time and the resultant operator corner cutting that caused both high and low profile Propliner disasters involving sports celebrities and teams, rock stars, and freight dog crews. You will also learn how one of the rare legitimate operators of old Propliners, who had the largest DC-6 fleet in the world during this era, impacted airline deregulation after 1978 and changed the airline industry forever. We delve equally into the technical and historical details of the airplanes and unravel this otherwise confusing era. I could go on forever about what is packed into this book, but instead of more of that, check out Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans for only $24.95 at Amazon.com. Today we're going to talk about the Pratt & Whitney R-1830 Twin Wasp aircraft engine and go for a ride in a B-24 Liberator bomber, one of the definitive aircraft types that used this engine in World War II and beyond. But first, let's take two quick crash courses on both the R-1830 engine and the B-24 it powered. The 14-cylinder two-row Pratt & Whitney R-1830 Twin Wasp was a contemporary competitor of the 9-cylinder single-row Curtiss-Wright R-1820 Cyclone, each developing 1,200 horsepower in their most common forms. As a testament to this similarity, the DC-3 and military counterparts were manufactured with each of these engines, and the two main strategic heavy bombers of World War II were powered by these engines, the B-17 with the R-1820 and the B-24 with the R-1830. The R1820 in this single-row class is covered in the previous video in this series, The Poor Man's Hangar Tour, Episode 2, the Wright R1820 Cyclone, and the Boeing B-17. Hi, John Reed, Aerodinosaur. Behind me here is my scale replica of a B-24J I was flying at the beginning of this program. In a few of my earlier videos, many of you have taken note of it sitting on this shelf and have asked about it. So, since the B-24 is a big part of this episode, I thought I'd start things off by demonstrating it for you. She's capable of 70 miles an hour, but that speed is unrealistically high in terms of scale, as a real B-24 is not capable of near supersonic speeds. So, I fly it at a lower, more scale speed. But later in this episode, we'll take a ride in a real B-24A, obviously at realistic airspeeds. Now, back to our main subject. There were no definitive two-row radial engines manufactured before 1932. You'll recall the single-row 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Jr. of 450 horsepower used in the Beech 18, which was covered in Episode 1 of this Poor Man's Hangar Tour series. Its cylinders had a bore and stroke of 5.2 inches by 5.2 inches, or that's called a square bore and stroke. In 1932, Pratt & Whitney took 14 of these cylinders to create the R1535 Twin Wasp Jr. using two rows of 7 cylinders. It was introduced at 625 horsepower, going to 725 horsepower in 1933 and 835 horsepower at 2,400 RPM in 1934. So, this twin-row engine developed similar horsepower to the single-row 9s of the day, such as Pratt & Whitney's 9-cylinder R1690 Hornet. But the Twin Wasp Jr. had a diameter of 44 inches compared to the draggier 55-inch diameter of the Hornet. That said, the Hornet was a lighter engine requiring a shorter takeoff run and achieving a higher climb rate. So, a big advantage of the two-row Twin Wasp Jr. was that its smaller frontal area allowed for less drag and faster air speeds at given power settings, and the engine ran smoother, which reduced pilot and crew fatigue. Also, the two-row engine had much more potential and room to grow to achieve much higher horsepower levels than the single-row Radial. The two-row R1535 also represented a short period of airframe transition from the fabric and wire biplanes, such as the early retractable gear Grumman F2F1 and F3F1 biplanes, to the all-metal low-wing monoplanes such as the Vought SB2 Vindicator and the very fast Hughes H1 Racer. At the time of the R1535 introduction in 1932, Pratt & Whitney was also working on a larger version of the two-row Radial, the 14-cylinder R1830 Twin Wasp, using larger 5.5 by 5.5 cylinders. It was introduced in 2 horsepower versions, 775 horsepower at 2,400 RPM and a 6:1 compression ratio, or an 825 horsepower version at a 6.5:1 compression ratio. By 1936, this engine was rated at 1,000 horsepower at 2,600 RPM, and by World War II, it was rated at its definitive 1,200 horsepower at 2,700 RPM. A contemporary of the earlier 1,000 horsepower R1830 air-cooled Radial was the 1,040 horsepower liquid-cooled 12-cylinder inline V Allison V1710-33 fighter engine. This engine, with its long propeller reduction gearbox, was best known for its role with Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group, or Flying Tigers, which single-handedly took on and wreaked havoc on Japanese air power over China and Burma early in World War II, before U.S. Army Air Forces could be committed there after 1942. The Flying Tigers initially flew the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, a scale model of which is shown here parked inside my poor man's hangar. The Flying Tigers were not the first to use the shark mouth artwork on the noses of their aircraft, but they were the group who made that graphic famous, being used on military aircraft to this day. The basic Allison V1710 evolved into a powerhouse of greater than 2,000 horsepower in the early post-war years, and that evolution will be summarized as we move on with our Poor Man's Hangar Tour series as we cover each increasing radial engine horsepower class. Other than the early Rolls-Royce V1650 Merlin V12, which will be summarized in future videos, another comparable engine contemporary with the earlier R1830 was from Nazi Germany, the Daimler-Benz DB601 inverted V12 of 2,069 cubic inches, that developed approximately 1,160 horsepower in the Messerschmitt Bf109F just behind it. Most of the German inline and V-types utilized the inverted V-cylinder bank configuration, presumably allowing for better pilot visibility in single-engine applications. Getting back to radial engines, the R1830 required the new and expensive 100-octane fuel to achieve 1,200 horsepower. On the contrary, the R1535 used cheaper 87-octane fuel, but could not achieve 1,200 horsepower. So it was decided to increase the displacement capacity of the R1830 so it could burn cheaper, lower-octane fuels, ultimately resulting in the R2180. This new engine was scaled back slightly with the R2000 Twin Wasp D, which could achieve the desired 1,200 horsepower on 87 or 90 octane, and later 1,450 horsepower on 100 octane. This became a moot point during World War II when the price of the 90 and 100 octanes quickly fell closer to 87 octane. But the R2000, which will be covered in more detail in the next episode 4 of this series, became a successful engine anyway, even though it evolved out of the R1830 more or less by accident. So now, as far as the 14-cylinder R1830 goes, we now know the before, which was the 14-cylinder R1535 Twin Wasp Jr., and the after, which was the 14-cylinder R2000 Twin Wasp D. So, for the rest of this episode, we'll just focus on the planes that flew with our subject 14-cylinder R1830 Twin Wasp. Besides the DC-3 C-47 and the B-24, aircraft utilizing the R1830 Twin Wasp included the P-36 Hawk, the Martin M130 China Clipper, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which also used the Wright R1820, the Consolidated PBY Catalina, the Consolidated PB2Y Coronado, the Short Sunderland. Whoops, here's a clip of the Sunderland from our video, Short Sunderland, In Your Face, Low Passes, 1993. The R-1830 also powered this ungainly thing, the Bud Conestoga, which was designed and built by a company that was better at building rail cars than airplanes. It used stainless steel instead of aluminum skin. In 1945, this was the first transport used by the air transport company Flying Tiger Line, which was absorbed into Federal Express in 1989. Here's a photo I took in 1985 of part of the only surviving Bud Conestoga in existence at the Pima Air Museum in Tucson. Here's a brief sequence of my radial-controlled C-47 replica that you've seen over my shoulder on the shelf under my B-24. On the ground and in flight, it always carries a small vial of sand that I collected from Omaha Beach at Normandy, France. And here's some other C-47 footage I shot at Oshkosh 2019, all using standard R-1830 power. The Consolidated B-24 was first designed as a backup plane for the Boeing B-17 in case Boeing experienced problems efficiently getting their B-17 off the design tables and into World War II. However, the B-24 wound up going into full production as a complement to the B-17, not as a backup, and ultimately more than 19,000 B-24s were built, exceeding the production of any U.S.-built military plane to this day. By contrast, slightly over 12,700 B-17s were built. The B-24 was manufactured in no fewer than 15 variants for numerous roles in addition to its primary role as a versatile bomber, including cargo and fuel transporters and aerial mapping and reconnaissance roles. In this program, we'll detail only the definitive primary variants. So, why did the B-24 go from a backup plan to a key part of the primary plan? Because it was a newer, technologically superior design with much greater range than the B-17, due in part to its lower drag Davis wing design, but it could carry a similar bomb load. The B-24's roller shutter bomb bay doors hugged the fuselage sides when opened and didn't hang out in the open below the fuselage like the B-17, greatly reducing drag during ordnance drop. Both the R-1820, which powered the B-17, and the R-1830, which powered the B-24, developed 1,200 horsepower on takeoff. In these bomber applications, both engines had a single-speed gear-driven supercharger, coupled with an exhaust-driven turbocharger for high-altitude operations up to around 30,000 feet or more. For both aircraft, the superchargers were located at the lower rear portion of each engine nacelle under the wing with a single exhaust dump. The downside of the B-24 was that it was less stable in flight, causing higher levels of pilot fatigue, and it was more vulnerable to combat damage and was easier to shoot down in flames, detracting from the morale of some B-24 crews. The B-17 was a battle axe by comparison, but certainly not immune from being blown out of the sky. The B-24 served in every bombing front in World War II, comprising approximately 30% of the heavy bomber fleet of the 8th Air Force based in England, whereby the B-17 made up 60% of that fleet. During that period, the B-17 received most of the publicity with the 8th Air Force. Both the B-17 and the B-24 operations with the 8th Air Force received comparable high casualty rates. Unfortunately, in that theater, the Liberator's range and speed superiority was not that advantageous when flying in formation with the slower B-17s on a heavy bombing mission over Germany. The B-24D was best known for its role in the less than successful 1943 low-altitude bombing raids on the Ploesti Romania refinery complexes that supplied Nazi Germany with fuel. These raids were staged out of Libya. Many say that the B-24's most valuable contributions to the war effort was with the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Navy against U-boats and other anti-shipping roles, particularly in the North Atlantic and over the vast Pacific. It quickly supplanted the B-17 in maritime roles because of its superior range. Here, the B-24 was designated as the PB-4Y-1, where we detail its low and medium altitude anti-shipping roles, often on solo missions. In our earlier video, rare consolidated PB-4Y-2 action on this Aerodinosaur channel. We obviously cannot detail all the B-24 variants, but the B-24J Liberator heavy bomber version was the most produced variant with nearly 6,700 built, so we will now present its definitive statistics. The main difference between the B-24J and the earlier next most produced variant, the B-24D, is that the D had a plexiglass greenhouse nose with minimal firepower, causing it to be vulnerable to head-on attacks by German fighters. The J remedied this by placing a large gun turret on the nose housing with two 50 caliber guns. This is my scale replica of a Navy PB-4Y-1 Liberator that I built, which also sports a nose turret, though featuring a rounder and smaller gun turret preferred by the Navy. This one flew as an aerial mapping platform until late 1955. In the years before its retirement, its guns were removed as they were not normally necessary for mapping. The B-24J had a wingspan of 110 feet and a length of 67 feet. It had an empty weight of 36,500 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds with a bomb load capacity of 8,800 pounds. The J had a maximum speed of 297 miles per hour and cruised at around 215 miles an hour with a maximum range of 1,540 miles at 25,000 feet with normal fuel and maximum bomb load. Also, it had a service ceiling of 28,000 feet. The crew of 11 consisted of a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, one top turret and one nose turret gunner, two waist gunners, one lower ball turret gunner, and one tail gunner. This involved 10 50 caliber Browning machine guns in 4 turrets and 2 waist positions.
This was the headquarters of the Luftwaffe Air Defense Command. The surprise was Wasp. The alert was sounded, and the best that the Luftwaffe had was set up in defense. The only guy who can drive on to the airport with a truckload of dynamite and not get arrested. Cell phone carriers, you can blow up the airport. Great for you today. Again, these individuals, this is one of the 2 air shows where they get to practice for the high density formations that you see here and Oshkosh 1993.
Thanks to contributor Bill Bacon of Denver, Colorado, we're now going for a ride in the Commemorative Air Force's B-24A, named Diamond Lil, with its greenhouse nose, in footage he took in the early 1990s. At that time, the Commemorative Air Force was known as the Confederate Air Force. We will be flying in formation with their B-29 Fifi, powered by four 2,200 horsepower Curtiss-Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclones, and their B-26 Invader, powered by two 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R-2800B engines. We figure that if our viewers are interested in R-1830s and B-24s, they certainly won't mind the air-to-air footage of the B-26 and B-29 in formation while the Liberator's 1830s hum along. Diamond Lil was the 25th Liberator built and was first supposed to be delivered to the British, but instead it was turned over to Transworld Airlines in Kansas City, Missouri, which trained B-24 crews in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Later, during much of the war, this plane was modified into a C-87 transport used to haul personnel and cargo between the 5 B-24 production plants in the U.S. You'll notice that instead of the exhaust dumping through turbochargers at the bottom of the nacelles, no turbochargers were installed, as the aircraft did not need them for this role. Instead, the exhaust dumped through two outlets on top of each nacelle over the upper wing just forward of the leading edge.
Just got back from a trip to England. It was due to go to England to start with and become a LB-30 instead of a B-24A. However, due to maintenance problems, it was canceled and stayed in the United States until 51 years later, where it was flown to England for a celebration and then back to the United States. Cockpit flight control instrument panel of the B-24A/LB-30. Throttle quadrant, trim,
you got your mounts to the left.
Yeah, but he's going to turn to the right.
Okay, that's right, that's right. That'll be correct.
We fly real close. It'll be about 5 foot off the tail, and I'll have the wings right.
Was that close?
Oh my God. Patient information, and I'll usually ride high.
here's the pilot of the B-29 and the pilot of the B-24.
Okay.
And that flight briefing for the flyby
if you'd rather be on the right
USAF
side,
Academy.
you know, we're going to go straight on out from the academy and then just,
Okay.
you know, and
We'll look at it.
Yeah.
See how close it is. So I can be on the right.
Contamination. A little bit about Diamond Lil.
Diamond Lil's an old timer. They call her Grandpappy. She's the 25th one made out of nearly 18,000. She was made in May of 1941. It's actually an LB-30 or B-24A model, destined for Europe. However, it had an accident on the delivery flight. And 51 years later, would you believe it, we got it there, June the 10th of this year. We made it to the 120th Squadron in Kinloss, Scotland. And boy, was that historic. It's a little late, but never.
Better late than never.
Better late than never. So it was a historic flight for us and the Confederate Air Force. flight we'll be taking today will be from Grand Junction over to Colorado Springs. As you see, it's a beautiful day. We like to always have Mondays to be beautiful days. And we're hoping that you get some excellent pictures. It'll be a nice flight down through the canyons, and we'll be flying pretty high today. Aircraft has heaters, unbelievable that they still work, but we've got them working for our Atlantic crossing.
I understand it was manufactured as a B-24A, but on acceptance by the British, it would have become an LB-30. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Getting ready for engine start at Grand Junction for a flight to Air Force Academy and Colorado Springs Municipal Airport. I'm in Diamond Lil. Takeoff roll from Grand Junction in the B-24 Miss Diamond Lil.
there also.
That would be what you're talking about the assessment.
The redemption is getting back on my feet and out here speaking to people. And I enjoy it. People haven't heard of Air America or the people that died here, which we appreciate. Most places that come on the glacial stuff, wow, long
Landed in Colorado